Recently, I was reading the works of Baron de Holbach. Baron de Holbach was a famous figure within the French Enlightenment, a very well known philosopher and writer, and specifically, I was reading his book, The Systems of Nature. In this work, he critiques and criticizes many of the traditional ideas of theology that we have, including, Christian theology in particular. And he critiques a lot of the theologians. So it was an interesting work to read because, as somebody who reads a lot of theology and engages very heavily with theology, more specifically within the Islamic tradition, but also slightly and partially within the Christian tradition, it was a really interesting read to see what exactly he took issue with when it came to the science of theology. Of course, even though I don't necessarily agree with his ideas, I still see the benefit in reading them and appreciating their strengths, critiquing those things I don't agree with, and then moving forward with whatever his ideas are. I don't see a point in ignoring his critiques, mainly because that doesn't help or serve anybody, and glorifying my own ignorance of people who critique theology is a rather weak thing to do intellectually. And, I would say that the whole tradition of mankind, every single book, every single thinker within the broader human legacy is worth studying. And no ideas should go unstudied. All ideas are worth of being studied and worth of having had attention, let's say, our attention pointed towards them. Because ultimately, whatever ideas one individual may not fancy or find particularly appealing or correct, another person may do so. And so it's very naive to just dismiss an idea because you don't agree with it. So, even though I don't agree with Holbach's assessment of theology, I still decided to read his work and go to the extent of trying to understand what he said. And his critiques of theology were actually quite interesting, and I found some element of truth to what he was saying. The crux of his argument against theology, which I would summarize as, is that he would say that theology distracts us from the study of nature and of material matter, which is what is deserving of being studied. Instead of studying nature and in studying the laws of nature, studying the attributes of nature from which we come from, right? Because we are composed of matter, we are composed of the material universe around us, its elements, and we are bound by these laws. What theologians ended up doing was they began to abstract, they began to form these abstractions of reality, and then they began to project things onto them, such as our human attributes, or attributes that we should have been designating or attributing to nature or matter or the universe more broadly, and we began projecting them onto this abstract, theoretical, transcendent entity. And this is what we would call God. Obviously, this was done by stripping nature, stripping the universe of its attributes that we observed, and then attributing it to this God. But it also happened in the way that when it came to certain human attributes, which we deemed to be the standard of perfection, such as intelligence, such as wisdom, we deemed these attributes to be so perfect, and hence we appointed them as part of the standard of perfection, so to speak. And hence we began to attribute these to this kind of transcendent, abstract God who was perfect in these attributes in comparison to humans. And so, in other words, what was rightfully nature's and what was rightfully man's, we created this kind of transcendent abstraction, this very theoretical thing. We called it God, we called it the transcendent creator and ruler of the universe, and we began to attribute to it all of these things of perfection, which really and truly speaking were the subject of matter, the subject of physical things, the subject of us, but we ended up designating it to some theoretical being instead. And that's a really interesting critique that I found. And he even goes, for example, to critique somebody like Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton, who is the great scientist of the English speaking world, but he was also a theologian, which a lot of people don't know, and he was very heavily influenced by theology. And he critiques Newton by saying, well, you're a genius and you're so well versed in all of these scientific matters, what is the need for you to engage in these abstract thinkings which you yourself admit are, something which you are ultimately blind from? You cannot fully understand their reality. And so by creating these sorts of abstractions, which ultimately human beings cannot fully understand or comprehend, you are essentially belittling the role that nature has to play, or you are essentially downplaying these attributes which are in fact a part of nature, a part of the broader universe, a part of the cosmos. For example, the ideas that there is a God who is sort of, let's say, immanent, a God who is immutable, a God who is the origin of things. These are, in fact, the attributes of the universe, of nature, of matter, because they give birth to us. They don't cease to exist, rather, they change form. And we ended up abstracting these things and appointing them for a God. And like I said, obviously, with the example of human beings, attributes which we consider for ourselves to be those of perfection, such as intelligence and wisdom, we ended up abstracting them, considering them in a transcendent, perfect manner, and then attributing it to the supposed theoretical standard of sort of transcendence and perfection. In other words, God, or this kind of transcendent, abstract, ultimately unknowable entity. And it essentially took us from the realm of what is knowable and observable, which is nature and matter, to the realm of ultimately what the human mind cannot comprehend or understand, which is this idea of an abstract transcendent God. That critique is a really interesting one, I think, and it's one that deserves a bit of thought because it is, in a sense, true. We are oftentimes dealing with very abstract things, very abstract notions when it comes to theology, things that ultimately we can't fully understand, or they are not necessarily irrational. It's just that the mind cannot fully comprehend their existence. Even if the mind was to accept the possibility of their existing, the mind cannot necessarily fully grasp their reality. And that's a really interesting point, then. But I would just like to point out, though, that this idea of abstraction, and this is where I would begin to critique Holbach, if we want to take this idea of abstraction, then the critique actually extends itself even onto Holbach and to all the other Enlightenment thinkers who would critique theology. In fact, the idea of abstraction itself, this idea that making these kinds of abstractions away from nature or away from the physical world is ultimately an irrational thing to do, would actually extend to the very beginnings of human society. Because let's just think about this. Consciousness and our ability to be rational in and of itself contains within it the seeds of the ability to think about things in abstract terms. So if consciousness itself and our rational faculties give us the ability to think about things in more abstract terms, rather in literal pragmatic is terms, then would this objection extend itself to our consciousness and our rational faculties? Furthermore, many of our institutions, many of the laws that we intuitively consider correct, our customs, our traditions, notions of a nation or a family that gives us meaning, that transcends this mere material world, is also, in a sense, an abstraction. So, would this be correct still? And the people who may oftentimes use this argument of, theology really is just an abstraction of the real world, this argument oftentimes also extends to them. Because I see many times, for example, on certain online circles, certain people who adhere to certain folkish ideologies often invoke paganism as a counter to the axial age religions because they believe the axial age religions dealt in abstracts instead of the real world. But these objections, this objection of abstraction, can very easily apply to paganistic religions as well, to polytheistic religions, because they attribute to divinity, to idols, to these polytheistic gods, what they would argue perhaps is the rightful matter of nature. And they may say that, well, their idols or their gods carry this kind of symbolism, but that is still an abstraction. And so, this idea of the abstraction, when taken to its logical conclusion, extends to the people who themselves are making this objection against theology. So, clearly, it does not stand to reason. Like I mentioned, furthermore, consciousness and our rational faculties give us the ability to think about things in abstract terms. And so to use our rational faculties, which in and of themselves think about things in abstract terms, to critique the thinking of things in abstract terms, is a slightly absurd and paradoxical thing to say. So I would begin to critique this by saying that, well, thinking about things in abstracts, in the case of theology, for example, isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it may even be a necessary thing. What I will say, though, is that there is a benefit to what Holbach is saying. Without a doubt, people often ignore the studying of nature, and people oftentimes ignore the real laws of the universe for the sake of thinking about things in a very abstract manner. And they often ignore real world conditions, or they often ignore the way the real world is, the physical world, because of their more theoretical thinking. And so, whilst we should think about things theoretically and abstractly, we shouldn't ignore the physical world, the evidence of the outside world, and we shouldn't ignore things like science or scientific observation. And so, without a doubt, Holbach is right in that sense. There's also an interesting point here that, can a god truly be transcendent in the way that certain religions claim to be? Because what does it mean for a god to have existence, have being, without in the first place having some kind of similitude to the creation, to the created things? What does that mean exactly for, let's say, God to exist, but he is not a body, he is not this, he is not that, he is not like anything in the creation? What exactly does that even mean in the first place? Does existence have any meaning without these attributes which we normally ascribe to the existence of the creation? And that also is an interesting critique. Whilst I don't agree with these critiques per se, and I have and many others have critiqued those critiques in other videos and in other works, it is an important point to be taken into account, and it is a important dialogue that has to be had. And I do very much appreciate the ideas that Holbach has given about theology and his subsequent critiques of it.